Look at her!
She thinks she can do it.
She's gonna fail.
With just over 500 hours in the cockpit of a trainer jet, stood under the towering shadow of the aircraft that had humbled men twice her age, men with thousands of hours logged, men with decorations on their chests. Her flight suit looked identical to theirs, her boots pressed against the same tarmac. But in their eyes, she did not belong. "Donovan," one of the veterans muttered, his voice low but not low enough. "You should just watch. Let the real pilots handle it." The words weren't new. She had heard them in the barracks, in the mess hall, whispered during briefings when they thought she couldn't hear. And every time, the phrase carried the same sting. Real pilots. As if she were a fraud. As if the blood, sweat, and sleepless nights had been counterfeit. She kept her eyes forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had trained herself not to flinch, not to respond. Inside, though, the words coiled tight, pressing against her ribs like a weight she could never put down. The training schedule at the base was unforgiving. Dawn drills, midday simulations, evening debriefs that dragged past midnight. The men complained, but they endured because endurance was proof of belonging. And Claire, well, she endured too. More quietly, more relentlessly. She didn't collapse into the bunks after 12 hours. She studied. She wrote down checklists. She replayed flight recordings until her eyes blurred. But no amount of persistence could erase what they saw when they looked at her. Inexperience, youth, and worse, a woman daring to step into a sky that many of them thought belonged only to men. It was not part of the standard rotation. It was a test, a crucible, one that separated legends from casualties. Pilots had attempted to master it before, and most walked away shaken. A few had been carried away instead. The brass decided it was time for the new class of candidates to face it. Not alone, not in combat, but in simulation drills that mimicked its unpredictable behavior. To fly this machine was to wrestle a storm inside a steel cage, and to land it was to command the storm itself. In the mess hall, the announcement rippled through the room like static electricity. Some pilots grinned, eager for the challenge. Others leaned back, folding their arms, pretending not to care. But the undercurrent was clear. This was the test that would define them. Claire heard the muttering before the official briefing even ended. Half the guys won't make it. Every page blurred together, but she forced her mind to stay sharp. She whispered checklists to herself like prayers. Throttle idle, fuel cutoff, gear down, over and over, until the words carved themselves into her bones. Yet in the silence of the barracks, doubt crept in. She remembered every sideways glance, every smirk, every word. Let the real pilots handle it. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Her heartbeat was a drum inside her chest. But beneath the fear was something else. Something older. Something unyielding. It was the same spark that had pushed her to apply to flight school when everyone in her hometown said she should stay grounded. The same fire that had carried her through endless obstacle courses, bruised and breathless, while others quit. The same stubbornness that had kept her climbing into cockpits even after instructors told her she wasn't cut out for it. The fire was still there. Quiet. Steady. A promise. The next morning, the hangar was alive with energy. Sunlight spilled across the tarmac, catching the metallic sheen of the jet waiting like a sleeping predator. Crews moved in practiced rhythm, checking panels, tightening bolts, fueling the beast. The air smelled of jet fuel and nerves. Claire approached with her helmet under her arm, her steps measured. The pilots went in. One by one, the jet spat them out. The simulations ended in alarms, in red lights flashing across screens, in debrief officers shaking their heads. Each failure added to the tension, winding it tighter and tighter. By the time Claire's name was called, the room was heavy with disappointment. The veterans had gone. The confident ones had been humbled. The so-called real pilots had left their pride smoldering in the dust. And now, all eyes turned to her. She rose, adjusted her helmet, climbed the ladder, and for the first time, silence fell over the hangar. No mutes, no whispers, just silence. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed. The canopy closed with a hiss. The controls waited, still and unyielding beneath her gloves. Her breath fogged the glass for a moment before clearing. She placed her hands on the throttle and the stick, steady, deliberate. She could almost hear their words echoing in the back of her mind. Let the real pilots handle it. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Not of arrogance, not of defiance, but of something deeper, a quiet certainty, because the truth was she hadn't come this far to be dismissed. She hadn't endured the whispers and the laughter and the nights alone with nothing but doubt for company, just to walk away. No, she was here because she belonged here, and whether they believed it or not, she would prove it. The jet roared to life, vibrations coursing through the cockpit, rattling through her bones. Outside, the others watched, some with folded arms, some with clenched jaws, some with the faintest flicker of unease. And as the simulation began, as the beast of steel and thunder reared against her grip, the story of Claire Donovan truly began. Because in the end, when the dust cleared, when the records were written, this test would not be remembered for the men who failed. It would be remembered for the one they doubted, the one they dismissed, the one who stepped into the cockpit and refused to step back out. The hangar buzzed like a hive. Mechanics scurried over the aircraft, tightening bolts, checking wires, murmuring in clipped voices. The air was heavy with fuel fumes and something less tangible, anticipation. On the runway, the jet waited, sleek, angular, almost predatory. Its dark frame seemed to drink in the morning light. It wasn't just a machine. It was a trial, a crucible. Every pilot on the base knew its reputation, and none of them carried that knowledge lightly. They called it the Widowmaker. Not officially, of course, but the name passed from mouth to mouth. A grim badge earned over years of failed tests and broken pilots. No one wanted to admit fear aloud, but the weight of the nickname clung to every glance, every nervous chuckle, every whispered prayer. Claire Donovan stood at the edge of the tarmac, helmet in hand, eyes fixed on the beast. She wasn't the first to face it today. She wouldn't be the last. But the outcome of each attempt would carve the path ahead for her and for everyone watching. The first volunteer was a veteran, Captain Harris, 12 years of service, combat experience, medals pinned neatly to his uniform. He carried himself with an easy confidence, the kind born of long familiarity with danger. "You boys can relax," he joked as he adjusted his gloves. "The real pilot is here." The words were meant to draw a laugh, and they did. A few chuckles rippled through the group, glances flicking toward Claire as if to underline the jab. She didn't react, not outwardly. Her eyes never left the jet. Harris climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed. The engines roared to life. For a moment, the hangar filled with raw power, vibrations thrumming through the floor like the heartbeat of some caged beast. Then the simulation began. At first, everything looked controlled, smooth. He eased the throttle forward, executed the climb, banked left, banked right. His movements were crisp, professional. But then, turbulence protocol. The jet bucked hard, twisting as though some invisible hand had struck it sideways. The control stick rattled violently. The HUD flashed red. Warning tones screamed into his headset. Harris fought it, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, sweat shining on his forehead. The jet refused. It twisted harder, pitching nose down, dragging itself toward a spiral. "Stabilize," the instructor barked from the ground. "I've got it," Harris shouted back. But he didn't. The simulation ended in a blur of alarms and flashing red. The canopy lifted. Harris ripped off his helmet, his face pale, his breathing ragged. The smirk was gone. He climbed down silently, his boots heavy against the ladder. The hangar was quiet, too quiet. No one laughed. One by one, the others followed. Lieutenant Markson, Commander Ruiz, pilots with thousands of hours between them. Each went up with confidence. Each came down humbled. The jet's movements were unpredictable. A sudden roll when the pilot braced for a climb. A nosedive when they adjusted for a bank. It was like wrestling a living thing, a beast of steel and fire that refused to bow. The failures piled up, alarm after alarm. Crash after crash. Red lights reflecting on pale faces. The instructors exchanged grim looks. The ground crew shook their heads. And in the watching crowd, whispers grew louder. No one can control it. It's impossible. This thing's not meant to be flown. Claire listened. Not to the words. Not to the doubts. But to the silence between them. The silence of men who had believed themselves untouchable. So then this stripped border. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the tarmac. Sweat slick flight suits. Tempers frayed. Still, the line of names grew shorter. Lieutenant Anders tried next. Younger, cockier, still clinging to bravado. It's all about finesse, he bragged before climbing in. These old guys just muscle it too hard. Minutes later, his voice cracked over the comms as the jet spun out of control. I can't. Then static. Then silence. When the canopy opened, Anders stumbled out, helmet in hand. Shame etched deep into his expression. No one met his eyes. By late afternoon, the mood had shifted completely. The bravado was gone. The laughter had died. Where once the pilots had smirked, now they stared at the jet with wary respect, as if it were a predator pacing in a cage. And then the instructor's voice cut through the air. Next, Donovan. The sound of her name was like a ripple through the crowd. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. Some smirked again, but it was weaker now, brittle at the edges. Her? You gotta be kidding. She'll crash faster than the rest of us. This isn't a classroom exercise. She's not ready. Claire heard it all, felt it like stones thrown at her back. But her steps were steady, helmet under her arm, eyes forward. She walked past the veterans who had failed, past the younger pilots who stared at her with wide eyes, past the instructors who measured her with unreadable gazes. She walked toward the jet. The Widowmaker waited, silent, dark, patient. She paused at the foot of the ladder. For a heartbeat, she simply stood there, the sun casting her shadow long across the tarmac. Her fingers brushed the metal rung, and in that moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. For the others, this jet had been humiliation. For her, the engine screamed as the jet tore down the runway. Claire gripped the stick, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs like a war drum. The cockpit shook with vibration. The canopy rattled. Warning screamed again. The Widowmaker twisted, rolling into chaos, testing her resolve. Sweat stung her eyes. Her gloves slipped slightly against the stick. She thought of every laugh, every smirk, every whisper that had shadowed her. Let the real pilots handle it. The words rose in her memory like a challenge. Her jaw tightened. Not today. She whispered. She pulled, nudged, coaxed. The aircraft fought her. She fought back. Not with brute strength, but with patience, precision, and a stubborn refusal to break. Her voice stayed steady over comms, correcting pitch, adjusting roll, throttle balanced, gear locked. Minute by minute, second by second, the impossible unfolded. The jet responded. The beast yielded. And for the first time in its brutal history, the Widowmaker flew not as a storm, but as an aircraft under command. On the ground, the silence broke. She's holding it. No one's ever. Look at her. She's flying it. Veterans who had mocked her stared in disbelief. Younger pilots who had smirked now watched with wide, reverent eyes. Even the instructors, stone-faced and immovable, leaned forward as though afraid to miss a second. Because up there, alone in the sky, she was doing what none of them had. Then came the final test. Landing. The cockpit closed. The world outside faded. It was just her and the beast of steel roaring beneath her. Her hands trembled for a moment, only once, before they settled firmly on the controls. The headset crackled. Cadet, back out. You don't have to prove anything. She closed her eyes. She remembered the laughter, the words that had haunted her since day one. Let the real pilots handle it. And then she whispered, barely audible, I am a real pilot. Engines roared, the ground blurred, and the jet leapt into the sky. The first seconds were chaos. The nose jerked. The wings shook violently. Warnings flashed red across the dashboard. Any other pilot would have panicked. Most already had, but she leaned forward. She listened, gripping the railing, afraid to blink. "She's stabilizing it," someone whispered. Impossible. Unbelievable. It was happening. The jet climbed. It banked. It twisted in the air like a wild animal, finally meeting someone who understood its language. But then came the real test. An unexpected crosswind slammed against the fuselage. The jet tilted, nearly rolling out of control. Gasps filled the control room. One officer shouted, "She's going down." But inside the cockpit, her voice remained calm. "Not today." She countered with precision. Her instincts, sharpened through every humiliation, every moment of doubt, every sleepless night of study, took over. The jet leveled. The impossible machine obeyed her. On the runway below, her fellow pilots stood frozen, some with jaws clenched in disbelief, others with eyes beginning to shine, not with mockery this time, but with something else. Respect, because they all knew what it meant. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was mastery, and mastery under fire is what makes a pilot real. She guided the aircraft into a final approach. Dust whipped across the runway as wheels screeched against the ground. For one agonizing second, no one breathed. Then silence. A perfect landing. The jet was home, and she was the one who brought it there. The control tower erupted. Some cheered. Some fell into stunned silence. A few covered their faces, ashamed of their earlier words. But when she climbed out of the cockpit, sweat streaking her face, her steps steady, her eyes unshaken, there was no doubt left. The phrase, "let the real pilots handle it," would never be used against her again. Because in that moment, every single witness knew the truth. The real pilot was her. The control tower had gone silent. Every eye was on the sky. Every breath in the airbase seemed suspended, hanging by an invisible thread. The jet, that beast no one could tame, now approached the runway. Its engines still roared unevenly, coughing like a wounded animal. The fuselage trembled against invisible currents, fighting against gravity, against malfunction, against every doubt that had ever been spoken about her. And then, the wheels touched the ground. Screeching metal, sparks flying. The jet shuddered, bouncing once, twice, then settled. The runway trembled but held. For one long second, no one moved. No one breathed. The base seemed carved in stone, frozen between disbelief and awe. And then the impossible truth broke through. She had landed it. The jet that no one else could control, no one else could steady, no one else could bring home. She had done it. The radio crackled. At last a voice spoke. "Jet secured. Runway clear." That single line was enough. Cheers erupted. Mechanics dropped their tools. Commanders who had doubted her closed their eyes in relief. Even the pilots who once mocked her found their throats tight with something they couldn't name. Respect. She slowly climbed down from the cockpit, her boots meeting the tarmac with a quiet thud. The crowd formed without meaning to. Rows of uniforms, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on her. No one had planned a ceremony, and yet it felt like one. One by one, heads began to nod. A salute rose, then another, until the entire airbase stood in salute to the pilot they once dismissed. But she didn't bask in it. She didn't smile, or boast, or throw their words back at them. She simply looked out at the faces, nodded once in return, and walked past them, carrying herself with the same calm strength she had shown in the sky. Because for her, it had never been about proving them wrong. It had always been about proving the jet could be saved, the mission could be completed, lives could be spared. That was the difference. That was the lesson. Later, in the quiet of the hangar, she placed a hand on the jet's scarred metal skin. Mechanics swarmed around, already assessing the damage, already scribbling notes. But she wasn't thinking about technical reports. She was thinking about every whisper she had heard. "She's not ready. Let the real pilots handle it. She'll never last." And then she remembered the silence that fell when she took the controls. The silence when the jet touched the runway. The silence when respect finally replaced doubt. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of burnt fuel and steel. This wasn't just victory. It was vindication. Not only for her, but for every unseen, underestimated soul who had ever been told they were not enough. Word spread fast. By the next morning, her story traveled beyond the airbase. Soldiers at other stations spoke of the woman who landed the unlandable jet. Newspapers printed it in headlines. Pilots across the world heard whispers of her name. But she never chased the spotlight. When asked for a statement, she said only this: "I did what any pilot should do. I brought the jet home. Nothing more, nothing less." Her humility made the story greater. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about shattering stereotypes with speeches or defiance. It was about the quiet strength to act when others froze. And that's the truth, isn't it? Courage rarely announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like a young woman in a cockpit, steadying her breath when the world doubts her. Sometimes courage looks exactly like her. Reflection settled on the airbase. The men who once laughed at her now avoided her eyes, not out of shame, but out of respect too heavy to put into words. They knew now that being a real pilot had nothing to do with gender or years of swagger or loud confidence in the mess hall. It had everything to do with moments like the one she lived. Moments when disaster looms, when lives hang in the balance, and when someone chooses not to give in to fear. That's a real pilot.